Our next panel will discuss the symposium's headmark theme of the human face of battle. Our first panel member is Ms. Catherine McMullen, the Director of the Australian Geospatial Organisation. Her background is framed by studies and service in law and diplomacy, government and national intelligence. Welcome, Catherine. We're also privileged to be joined by the Commanding General of the Philippine Army, Lieutenant General Roy Galido. General Galido is an infantry officer commanding at every level up to regional command. He has significant operational experience in the southern Philippines, with particular focus on countering terrorism from the Abu Sayyaf group. He's also been involved in undertaking multiple hostage recovery operations. So welcome and thank you for joining us. I'd also like to welcome Lieutenant General Natasha Fox, AOCSC, the inaugural and current Chief of Personnel. A logistician originally, she has broad staff and operational experience, serving variously as the Head of People Capability and the Deputy Chief of Army. Ma'am, welcome. We're also honoured to be joined by General James Rainey, Commanding General of the US Futures Command, a career infantry officer with other notable commands including the 3rd Infantry Division, the Combined Security Transition Command in Afghanistan, and the US Army Combined Arms Centre. So welcome. And finally, it's a pleasure to welcome back 41st Chief of the Army, General Stuart. Now, to wrestle this very eminent panel, we are fortunate to welcome Professor Genevieve Bell, AO, as our moderator. Professor Bell is currently serving as the 13th Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University. An Australian cultural anthropologist, she is best known for her work at the intersection of cultural practice research and technological development. And after a long series of introductions, it's a pleasure to hand over to you, Genevieve.
All right, you're right. It's a distinguished and terrifying panel to moderate, and I realise in that case I should set out some rules of engagement because I figured that would be a thing that might resonate here. Number one, I know it's going to upset some people in the audience, but I plan to call everyone on the panel by their first name. I have checked in advance. I know, for instance, it's Jim, not James, though he does assure me he'll answer to almost anything, which feels like an offer you shouldn't make to an Australian woman. So, first names, partly because I will admit, although I am a cultural anthropologist, studying the rank of the military is not an exquisite form of torture I have yet engaged in. I've also promised that I will ask open-ended questions. I think sitting here this morning, listening to the way the conversation unfolded, I'm struck by the fact that while I suspect there's a lot of agreement, I also suspect there are lots of different opinions, and I want to unfold some of those where we can. Brett did introduce me as the Vice-Chancellor of the Australian National University. In that role, I spend a lot of time thinking about what it means to serve our nation, what the responsibility of a national institution is, how we build capability, how we think about the future, how we worry about what our responsibilities and roles should be and what the future looks like. I think that's why I'm here. And so I want to take everyone on this panel on that adventure with me, if that's okay. The only other piece of coaching I was cheeky enough to give to this distinguished group was to say that I didn't think any of these questions had a fully agreed to formulation, and Jim immediately assured me I was wrong. So I'm excited about where we're going to take this because I'm going to ask him the first question. And it's good that you don't yet look uncomfortable. Part of, I think, what unfolds in the conversations in this room today, Simon, in your op-ed piece, I think in the technology that we see on the floor and all the conversations that have been here, is this constant tension between whether what we are seeing is a radical transformation, a revolution, if you will, in how we think about warfare, or whether it's an evolution. And I know in any given moment of time, there are people who say it's just this, and this is a cycle we're going through. I know as someone who thinks about education, I'm often asked if we're in a moment where we need to profoundly change how we educate people. And we often make the case that we need to continue to educate people in the basics, but give them capacity to think about what's coming next. And often that capacity isn't technical, it's human. It's about teaching people to be good in conflict and crisis, teaching them about resilience, teaching them to make certainty where there is none, teaching them to be good conversationalists and good engaging with people who don't share their points of view. I'm not foolish enough to think that is what it means to think about revolutionary or evolutionary in the art of warfare. But Jim, which one?
Evolution, not revolution yet. I think what we're witnessing is a very scary and complex speed of evolution that's probably unprecedented. So the tech disruption of our profession is happening at a speed and scale that's unprecedented. To say there's a revolution in our profession is an incredibly high bar. Precision, gunpowder, the tank. So I don't think we're there yet. If there's one coming on the horizon, it's probably data-centric warfare and the impact of that. But nobody can do that yet. I think that we're close, we being us and our coalition globally and led out here by folks like General Flynn and General Stuart. I think we'll figure it out. It'll have a huge deterrent value, but not quite at the standard of a revolution yet.
So when we were standing off stage, not yet mic'd, you said you could see the revolution.
Yeah.
Is that the revolution,
Yeah,
data-driven warfare?
Yeah, whoever figures out how to move from connecting a sensor to a shooter to a sustainment enterprise and can move to truly data-centric warfare is going to be the person that's going to be able to take advantage of all the breakthroughs that are coming with large language models, machine learning, potential of quantum computing. The ability to capitalize on that is dependent on moving to an entirely new approach to moving data around. When that happens, that will revolutionize. But with one safety briefing, as Jack and Simon and others have pointed out, the nature of war, right, that is a contest of will between humans, that land is decisive, that Western civilized militaries will remain practitioners of the law of armed conflict. Those constants I see no indication that any of those are changing.
So the argument there is that the nature and reason for war doesn't change, but the way we enact it might.
Yeah, I get the advantage of being apolitical and staying out of policy. That's one of the good things about being in uniform. So who starts wars and why? But once they start, it's going to remain being about people. It's going to, as long as those people insist on living in the land, it's going to stay about the land. And I believe us continuing in all the chaos to abide by the law of armed conflict, what separates us from evil and good.
Catherine, I can see you nodding about the notion of revolutionary versus evolutionary here. You want to weigh in?
Absolutely. I mean,
from all the way down there.
Hello, down the end. I listening to Jim talk. I mean, I talk a lot in my organisation about volume and velocity. So my job is to enable the warfighter to go at pace. And in Simon's opening address, he talked about the NDS and the DSR talking about a reduced warning time. That narrows the velocity of which we need to understand, but it also narrows the velocity on which we need to then get the answer to enable a response or a counter response. And my organisation, understanding and knowing the globe, excuse me, so that you can respond. But all of that data, all of that technology that exists overwhelms the human. So how do we optimise technology for a human to make a smart, insightful decision in a supply chain of decision making? So it's dealing with volume, but responding with velocity in a much more accelerated timeframe.
Roy, I know you sit in a slightly, literally physically different place than here, and in a very, I think, different trajectory. I'm interested in how you think about the capability you'll need for the war that is unfolding, or the warfare that is unfolding, I think in some ways both evolutionarily and the revolution that's coming. Okay. How do you think about building capability for that?
Thank you for that. First of all, let me express my appreciation for being invited to this panel. And my thoughts are coming up from a country that experienced pre-colonial rule in their respective era, a country that has been beset by 50 years of internal conflict, and recently Islamic radicalism, Thus, hopefully, we don't get dominated on the forthcoming hegemon. But again, as mentioned by Dr. Jack, warfare right now has been changed by technology. I totally agree with that, and taking off from some keywords mentioned by our speakers earlier, how I wish issues or conflict can be resolved in the newest Olympic Games, the E-Games. I think that would be a game changer, but I'm sure that's not the purpose of warfare. But technology has brought us to that point that indeed, warfare is very much challenged when it comes to humanity, especially for a country trying to stand on its own, trying to counter a superpower, and again, taking cue from words from General Stuart, resiliency and sense of purpose is very important. Resiliency as we prepare, and sense of purpose is because we want to protect our sovereignty in accordance to the internationally accepted rule of law and the UNCLOS as we have signed. Very complicated on our part because we don't have that economic capability as of now. But you know, Filipinos, we're hospitable and we have plenty of friends. And I guess this is where our resiliency and sense of purpose comes in.
And how do you think that unfolds in terms of who will serve in your military and how you bring them along and ensure they're ready for what's coming?
Well, that's the biggest challenge in the Philippine Army. Well, I don't have problems in recruiting. In fact, I have 4,000 slots with 30,000 applicants. But more importantly is how I would prepare them in a different type of warfare. Technology warfare that could inject bigger damage than the warfare that we have experienced for the past 50 years, a small-scale one. And it would take for my organization, the Philippine Army, to train and work with our friends, with our allies, to expose us to this type of warfare that we are not used to.
So, Jim, you started with the steady evolution, revolution coming. How do you think about building capability in that particular time space?
You mean next 2 to 5 years?
Yeah.
So what we're spending a lot of time thinking about in the United States military and Army is it's not as simple as capability development. If you look at some of the things we've observed with Ukraine, cost matters, mass matters. So what we're talking about, and it's very germane to this audience, and my compliments to General Flynn and Simon and other leaders out here on the land side, is you really got to do, it's a 3-part formula. You got to have capability, you have to have capacity, and then you got to get it in position. So it's not as simple as do we have the capabilities we need or not. We all have budgets, and we absolutely should take advantage of the technical advantages we have to come up with exquisite capabilities. But we're balancing what capabilities do we need in what capacity, and both of those are irrelevant unless you can do what we're doing out here is fight for positional advantage, primarily to deter China, but that same positional advantage, if it does transition to conflict, is going to be the decider. The first battles are going to be decisive, not an opportunity to learn and go fix yourself and come back in 6 months like the luxury we've had at other times in our history. So you need all three, and balancing that on a whatever budget your country has is really the art of it.
And as you and Catherine both reflect, on a constrained time horizon. So we are no longer talking about cycles of 20 years. We're talking about much more compressed ones.
Tech adoption. We personally, in the United States, do not have a technology problem. We have a tech adoption, tech acquisition at the federal level. Our soldiers are very good at adopting new technology. It's our ability as a military to see something that absolutely exists and works and putting that into a formation, to include the leader development, the ability to train it, some doctrine, so it translates into a true capability.
It's always an interesting balance.
Yeah. 155 artillery is indisputably the #1 killer. It doesn't make it on Twitter. It's not as sexy as a quadcopter dropping a grenade into a hatch of an incredibly undisciplined tank crew, which fortunately we don't have. But, it's 155 artillery. Mass matters. And that's going to be applicable anywhere you fight, I think.
Can I bridge us out of the evolutionary conversation and the capability piece? I was really struck listening to Geraldine and the panel before lunch about the notions of how we think about the relationship between military and the societies that surround it. The conversation this morning was in some ways about social license to operate. I also think, and Jim, I'm sure this is as top of mind as it might be here in Australia, the dimensionality of social cohesion, of democratic resilience, of how we balance whether we think of oneself as being outside of politics or not. Politics is around us, and we live in places where there are complicated conversations about what makes a society coherent and whole. And it's striking to me in thinking about building capacity and capability and indeed willingness as to how we balance changes in society against that, because I think those are things that have to be in dialogue with each other, and when they aren't, we end up in really complicated positions. Natasha, I think about your role, in some ways newly created, and about how you sit in that, and about how you play out and balance that notion about the relationship between the military and the societies that it both serves and protects and draws from. Discuss.
Always interesting to talk to an anthropologist about societal matters, Genevieve. And it was really interested in the last panel hearing about that trust in society, the social licence to join the Australian Defence Force, that Western militaries in terms of recruiting are all facing the same issue about how do we recruit. I reflect on that quite substantially, and I look back over time, so study the history around recruiting to bring it forward. And when we had warning time, we had the opportunity to be selective and exclusionary. When you don't have warning time, how do we make it easy for people to serve? How do we remove the barriers for service and then let, as the last panel talked about, the training, the adaptation in training, the education, enable innovation and dealing with the unexpected, bring to the fore the capability, the human capability, the people capability. So for people in the audience, our applications in the Australian pipeline are the best that they've been since 2019. So people want to serve. And so how do we, through conversations with community, with removing those barriers for service, enable people to serve? And that's the work that we've been doing. So the propensity to serve in Australia is still there. It's been constant. Removing barriers to service is what we've been working through in a whole of a Five Eyes community, because as you start removing barriers and we operate as a coalition, what does that mean for the nature of the coalition, for the construction of the health system that might have a different type of demographic and makeup as a consequence of what we're doing now. So taking that capability forward. So they're the conversations we're having about enabling service. We need to have conversations in the community about what does that mean, and honest conversations, not the ones that have warfare, clean, quick, etc., that the panel talked about earlier this morning. I am conscious it's Are You OK Day today, and the conversation about moral injury. And so that is the humanity of war and what makes us different to machines.
it's interesting to unfold that in two different directions, right, Natasha? I'm struck, Jim and I were talking earlier, while I obviously am Australian, you can tell it by my accent and sometimes my attitude, I was educated in the United States, so I did my entire training in the US, in American universities, and spent time in American industry. And I was always really struck in my time there by the ways that the US military had been ahead of industry in terms of some of its employment practices. So I think about the US Army integrating the services with African American soldiers. I think about earlier work with Native Americans in the forces, particularly in World War I and World War II. I think about the way the US military and the Australian military have thought about what it means to have a military that reflects its society. And then to your point, Natasha, what it means on the other side to think about how we ensure that when people are no longer serving, they have a path back and through. And I think about all the work that that requires. And I guess I'm interested both, from Jim and Natasha, how you're thinking about what that next, in some ways, path-breaking work that the military will do ahead of industry in terms of how it thinks about capacity and capability. Okay, you're not allowed to point to each other. So I think he outranks you, so I think in this instance it's you.
I think she'll have a much more coherent answer than me.
So a very wise person in the audience, Kate, and I were having a conversation earlier about what it means in the human face of battle, and does EQ trump AI? And it's an interesting question to ask, given General Rainey's comment about the revolution is in sight. And what does that mean in terms of judgment, proportionality, intent, national will in the conduct of war, and that social licence to join our militaries in that construct? And so I do think, in terms of humanity, that EQ does at this point trump AI until we can code care into, and judgment more broadly, what General Rainey was talking about, into the conduct of warfare. And it goes to what Jack was saying, General Berger and the Chief of the Army was saying about our people, and how we give them the tools and the frameworks to make decisions, and knowing that there's a community around them in making those decisions. The isolation on a battlefield, the stigma that comes with a military warfare, what does that mean, and how do we help our people reintegrate back into community, knowing what they've done has been valued and that we care, is that issue around the morality of warfare and our people. So, but it is inherently human, and we are the capability at this point.
I love the choice of topics. It's all about people, especially in the armies. And listen, I acknowledge the world's dangerous. We all got challenges, but I am a optimist. Like a lot of my teammates out in the audience, I've had a little bit of combat experience. People do not follow pessimists around in firefights, right? So, we get paid to be optimistic leaders. And that's our biggest advantage. I mean, it is our asymmetric advantage, and it's people. It's a problem. It's something we should all work on. Everybody wish we had more people joining and everything else. But when we start talking about what we need to do to get ready for the future, the most important thing is to preserve the asymmetric advantage. We have people that volunteer to serve, first being conscripted. We have, I'll speak for my Army, we have an NCO Corps that I think is the envy of the world, and everybody should be trying to have one. That's like a superpower. We have leaders, both quality and at scale, compared to autocratic militaries that try and command, politically. And then we have commanders. We have men and women, 15, 20 years of experience, practicing the ethical management of violence on behalf of citizens under civilian control of the military. So preserving that gigantic people advantage is the thing that I spend most of my time thinking about. Way more important than any given piece of technology.
I'd hate to think you thought I was pessimistic, Jim. So I've never been accused of that.
I was just talking about myself, not you. But there is a lot of hand-wringing going on. It gets a little annoying at some point in time. All of us working together, things like this, like-minded people's coming together, trying to get better. People are going to pick, countries are going to pick, economic influence is one thing, but people are going to pick their security partners of choice. And if I was out here, I'd be picking this one.
I would too, that's why I'm here.
Can I share my thoughts?
Absolutely, Roy, I'd love to hear from you as well.
You mentioned about public trust and the society. What is very important right here, especially when we address our possible adversary, is the cognitive domain, which is very much important. And this cognitive domain is very much affected by technology. And if we would try to understand the adversaries that we might be confronting, they are adopting the concept of unrestricted warfare, wherein, as mentioned by Dr. Jack, that military professionalism, humanity in warfare, this is a different type. It's unrestricted. There's no rules in the warfare they're adopting. Thus, the question is, do we get the public trust of our society with the current capability of the armed forces or the Philippine Army? We are using the cognitive domain to steer nationalism, which is very important right now. Because all of us, we need to contribute to the growth of our economy. And you know how the impact when it comes to economy in that part of the region. All of us are connected to the possible emerging hegemon. And it's very complicated on our part. Thus, our position, we will be resilient. We take advantage of the cognitive domain, which we are doing right now, with the expression of support from like-minded nations on our position.
Thank you, Roy. And you've surfaced something that I imagine is on people's minds about moral authority. And I want to be clear here, part of what makes militaries remarkable and part of the reason you get to tell an optimistic story about what's coming is also because you have a population who believes that you are the best of them. And I am struck that we're having this conversation not just on Are You OK Day, but also on a day where our federal minister has stripped medals from serving military in Australia and previous serving military for what one would suggest were not moral acts. And so, Simon, I know you thought you were getting out of this conversation and you could sit here and be chief-like, but I think the question about how do we imagine and balance moral authority and moral trust feel like one of the most important questions for what it means to have the human face of warfare.
It absolutely is, because it gets to the core of who we are. I go back to some of the discussions we were having earlier today in terms of, that sort of sounds like a bumper sticker, an army in the community and an army for the nation, but that fundamentally situates us and our profession in relation to the society and the nation that we serve. Our entire purpose is to serve our nation and the people that comprise it, who they are, what their values are, what's their way of life, and what is their identity. And I think the point also was made earlier that the society, we want to be able to look in the mirror and see our society and the communities that we are drawn from want to be able to look in the mirror and see us. So I do think we can tend to look at these things as if they are somehow separate. They are one, because we have a single purpose. We are organised as a society that has a great deal of texture and richness and difference. Democracies are messy, but they're also a very effective way of ensuring that there can be a contest of ideas, hopefully a respectful contest of ideas, and that we can then unify. And why does that matter? Because the stakes are really, really high. To the point about the ethics, the morality, this is an area that is absolutely central to the study of, the understanding of, and the review of the state of our profession. It is at the heart. It's that, you've heard the term moral compass, and we've heard the term moral injury a number of times today. And I think that's really, really important that we look at that in terms of the broader health and well-being of our people, which is something that we really need to do more work on to understand. The physical, the mental, the moral, the spiritual, because at the end of the day, that is what a whole being is.
So I'm always struck in thinking about how you hold morality and how you ensure that acts that are in some ways complicated, morally speaking, are done in a way that can be reviewed, that there's a rule set, that there's an agreed set of ways of enacting these things. It's partly how you maintain, I think, the right to operate. Catherine, I know we were talking a little bit about this earlier, and I know you sit adjacent to these services, but how do you think about it in your branch of all of this?
Yeah, I mean, the intelligence community, historically we've sat in the shadows, and the sort of public perception of what we do can often be perceived as morally questionable. But increasingly, the intelligence community is part and parcel of enabling our warfighters. It is part and parcel of projecting Australia's security and prosperity. And it has a protective as well as a projection process. But what we do is actually bound by the exact same principles that underpin the ADF. We ask the same moral and ethical questions every time we're directed to do something. Is it within the authority of that directing minister or government? Is it legal? Is it proportionate to what the objective that we're trying to achieve is asking of us? Is it the right thing? And part of that process is to ensure that we are doing activity in a way that is both protecting our nation and advancing our nation, but in a way that would sit comfortably with our community. Because like the military, we have a social contract with our community, with our nation, and part of our responsibilities is to hold that core principle close. And when we go through that process, for some staff, and I've been in intelligence organisations where sometimes what you are asked to do is a challenge, and our job, just riffing off Natasha's acknowledgement of Are You OK Day, is to actually ensure the well-being of the staff. And if staff ever have moments of moral uncertainty about what they're being asked to do, we have to support them because they are a part of our service. We don't wear a uniform like my colleagues on the panel here, but we have still signed up to service and we have signed up to mission, and our responsibilities to protect and support the well-being, mental well-being, moral well-being of our staff is just as important, because we are a partnership, and if one part of the partnership isn't optimised and isn't working effectively, it's not better than the sum of all parts.
So, Natasha, Geraldine spoke a lot before the break about how to make what it is that the military does more visible to the population, not just in times, I think, of conflict, but more broadly, and how we surface values and orientations and in some ways the kind of parameters that condition the activity, because I think her line of argument was if you did that, you would bring people along on a journey better. And the bit about not only being visible when times are complicated, but when times are good. I'm sort of interested in how you're thinking about that as you're unspooling your role. And then Roy, you're on the hook for this one too.
I often have conversations with my colleagues about what do our recruiting ads look like and where are they at in terms of what forum. And I have to remind people that I'm not recruiting them, they're already recruited. So we are in places where generations are, the younger generations are, and those People who have family, whether that be their own children or relations, would know that they're not on TVs. Sometimes they're in cinemas. And so Roy's point about the cognitive domain and what forum we're on, we have put a lot of thought into tracking using the data that's available where our young people and probably not so young people are, so that we can communicate in the forums that they're on. I don't think yet we have a counter message that's potentially in the community about what we do. We perhaps let people see the work we do and let that speak for itself in terms of a military view, and perhaps we might need to be a bit stronger with here's what we're doing and accept that we will be contested. It is good to be contested because not everyone has all the good ideas, and from that respectful contestation you will get innovation.
Roy?
Okay, in terms of how I develop my soldiers, it is something we are transforming. Well, as you will have studied, internal security requires more manpower, but developing a territorial defense capability, you'll rely on platforms. Now, this is now the challenge for us. Do we maintain the 115,000 land force do I have, or we invest more on platforms that would deliver the kind or the proper defense capability we have? As we go through that process of transforming, we have to infuse education in each soldier, just like how Australia is doing it. They are being certified on certain skills. And this is what we lacked before. And we just cannot let go of our soldiers that easy, because they will fall to prey to being soldiers of fortune, which we don't want to happen, and very challenging for us. But we invest heavily now in re-educating and retraining them for the new environment that we have. It's not an overnight thing, probably 5 to 6 years or 10 years. And the only way to hasten this is through constant training with our allies. And we are fortunate. We are fortunate, especially when I did a staff talk with Natasha 2 years ago. I proposed to her, instead of Filipinos going here, why don't you go to the Philippines to train? Because both of us will be learning something new. I'm very much appreciative of that.
So, Jim, can I put you back in the hot seat for a minute? Jim's like, oh, are you gonna? I'm struck that this is obviously an Australian event. This is about the Australian Army, not only showcasing what it does, but I think making clear who its partners are and what we value. But I also know one of the things that always makes you better is hearing what other people think you're doing well and what other lessons you think people can give. I'm sure you tell Simon lots of things, but I'm wondering if there were one or two things that, as you think about where you've been, that we should be thinking about as we move forward, and especially with this kind of locus of how we think about the human element in all of this. What's the kind of outside-in point of view about this for us from where you sit?
I mean, we all have things we need to work on and things we're good at, and I have not spent a lot of time thinking about that. I'm here because I was invited and because this is an incredibly important region, and candidly, our relationship with Australia and the United States is one of the ones that we value as much as any one that we have. I will tell you this, I spent a lot of time in combat with the Australian Army. Several rotations, several times. I remember sitting in Kandahar on a night when no airplanes were flying, and there's one little tiny road that stretched up to Tarancot, which is in a bowl geographically, and knowing the men and women of the Australian Army were up there alone and unafraid and ready to fight bravely to represent their army and their country. I have a huge amount of admiration for your army.
And I think we thank you for that. And I think also it's always good, I think, to get to hear how other people think about you. It's partly what you also aspire to. It's not just looking in the mirror and seeing the community, but looking in the mirror and seeing the best version of yourself reflected back to you.
Yeah, we have a saying in our Army that relationships between commanders matter more than command relationships, So my relationship, I don't want to speak for General Flynn, but I've heard him talk about his relationship. And it's not just U.S. and Australia, it's all the armies that are represented here. We go to school together, we train together, we've fought together, and we'll fight together, if it comes to that next time. So, we all could do better at things, but I feel good about the relationships.
But it strikes me that coming out of that, the thing that human face of warfare describes in some ways the individual, what you're also reminding us is that relationships between individuals are as important as what the individual is themselves, right? That it's always about that connective tissue. Yeah. Connective tissue forged, both in educational environments, in training, in warfare itself. I imagine sitting around various forms of sporting events and alcohol and other forms of practice, because I've met us. I imagine all of those things are true.
I wouldn't know anything about the alcohol part, but
of course not.
But the rest of it, yeah. We're a profession of trust. Our profession is underpinned by trust. The extension of trust between humans on and off the battlefield, 2 soldiers in a firefight, 4-star, chiefs of armies, and I feel that trust is in a good place. It's fragile, but it's in a good place.
No, trust is one of those things that requires work, right?
Yeah.
So, Catherine, I know you also, I forget what your phrase was, I said military adjacent. I think you had a slightly more appropriate phrase than that, but sitting where you sit and thinking about how the conversation has unfolded today, what's the advice, maybe not, but the critical friends point of view? No pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. I, like Jim, I'm quite an optimist, so I listen to the debate and the contesting of ideas, and that actually gives me quite a degree of hope. The National Defence Strategy that the broader defence, the ADF and the department has coalesced around is more than that. It's a nation-building opportunity, because it's really about how we reframe the concepts of resilience, sovereignty, power projection as a middle power nation. And that's a really exciting proposition. And so I listened to the transformation that Simon outlined in his opening address. I listened to, sort of government and regional partners talk about what they need from us and what they want to see and how we display ourselves in a diplomatic sense. And that's all really, really exciting stuff. The challenge, of course, is to do it in a way that the system is still working and operating effectively, and we don't break elements. And that means some bits will go faster than others, but making sure that we're thinking about national defence as a holistic enabler for our communities, for our society, for our economic prosperity, is a really exciting proposition. It's scary about what that might look like in the next few years as our military transform, as our economic environment transforms. And for the intelligence community, we're transforming as well. We are absolutely reforming how we do our business. Like our 3 services here that are moving towards an integrated force, we are moving towards an integrated intelligence community, so that we are working hand in glove with my human partners, my SIGINT partners, my security partners, and all of that needs to come together to give strategic insight, to give warning, and to enable better decision making. And that's pretty fun. Everything's a recruitment opportunity, but it's a great business to be in.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned systems, Catherine. That's obviously one of my areas of expertise in thinking about complex dynamic systems, about the role of technology in those systems, about what the relationships are between the human and the technological. And some of my first encounters with Simon and at least one of his predecessors was really about what the role of AI might be in battle and in the military, both in terms of how we think about everything from supply chain management to warfare. And I remember a member of your service said to me, Simon, he's like, what I just need to know, Genevieve, is am I saluting it or is it saluting me? And I remember thinking at the time that is an incredibly reductive way of thinking about the role of technology, but really helpful because it made clear that we had work to do in terms of thinking about both what the technology was and how it would sit inside an ecosystem. Jim was clear at the beginning that we are in a moment of transformation. He was also clear, rightly so, that there is a portfolio of technologies that are in the 5 to 20 year horizon that will profoundly change the nature of many things. They will profoundly change how we think about who we are. They already are in some places. They will change the speed at which information, data, and its consequences can move. We already see them changing the nature of the reality that is presented to us on our screens. Are we looking at a thing that is true or a thing that isn't? The consequences of a technological landscape that is visible now but will only expand later feels like a piece that challenges some of the idea of a human face of all of this. Simon, discuss.
Thanks for the easy question, Genevieve. Well, I'll go back to one of my opening comments, which was as a military professional, or as military professionals, we spend a lot of time looking at, what's the relationship, the tension and the balance between war's enduring nature and its ever-changing character. That is the very same tension that those who have gone before us for the last 2.5 millennia have been challenged by. So we're no different to any generation that's gone before us. What is different is the technology and the rate of change that I think can often be overwhelming. So I think in that sort of balance between the two, it's additive. It's and not or. But where's the relative balance? And because warfare is a human experience, and again, there's no reason to think that it won't be in the future. We do need to pay attention to the effect that it has on people and the very purpose of a decision by a government, by a nation, to actually engage, in a conflict. The nature of the character of how warfare is then prosecuted, the tools that are used, I think it's also worth kind of expanding our perspective from the so-called wars of choice over the last 25 years that we've been involved in, where they were largely military or military-industrial complex focal areas. In an era of great power competition, defence, security, war becomes a national endeavour. So it engages all parts of our society. What we see gathered here in Melbourne today is industry, government, academia, and practitioners, soldiers, and some sailors and aviators and space and cyber operators. So what we are trying to achieve by bringing groups like this together is to figure out how do we work together, and part of figuring out how you work together is having at least a common understanding of what our challenges are. I don't think we walk away from these things with any firm answers, but I do think we walk away with a much clearer perspective around what the challenges are, who we might, invite to provide a different perspective because we don't have all the answers. I think AI is it's a global and a societal challenge. I read a fantastic book by an American author called The Atlas of AI. And one of the things...
Kate Crawford.
Kate Crawford, yeah.
She's Australian.
There you go.
So not an American.
Learn
Sorry, I'm going to claim
learn
responsibility.
something every day. But she talks about a range of really fascinating things, and I would recommend the book to anyone who's interested. But one of the things she talks about is algorithmic exceptionalism. And by that, she means that we, and it comes to the quote that you mentioned before, we tend to defer to or think that somehow artificial intelligence is a higher form of intelligence, and therefore, through its exceptionalism, we would defer to it, when actually it represents our collective intelligence with all of the biases, all of the flaws, and all of the advantages, that are in the way we think. So one of the sort of questions in my mind in terms of how it applies to warfare is if we are developing artificial intelligence tools and we're doing it in our own societies with our own backgrounds, are we effectively creating, two or more systems that simply replicate, but in a way that can act, has more capacity, scale, and works in far more pervasive and far quicker ways? Does it really revolutionise or change the fundamental nature? I'm not convinced that it does.
Yeah, well, you and I have discussed this previously. I'm not either. I think what it might do is create different dependencies. It certainly creates different supply chains and certainly different vulnerabilities. And I suspect different opportunities for how people might make sense of what's going on. I'm really struck by some of the early history of these connecting technologies and about the fact that the Crimean War, many years ago, was one of the very first wars that gets effectively a telegraph system, temporary, built in, and as a result, every day what's happening on the battlefield is being communicated back to London, both to military command but also to the newspapers. And you suddenly have this capacity for the thing to be seen in a different way by a different audience who weigh in with their opinions in real time. And the vulnerabilities and affordances of that changed the way people made sense of war, because it was now effectively broadcast, but it meant that people's decisions lived inside different vectors. And I think it also created a whole new set of vulnerabilities that we're still playing out 160 years later. I realise I've run the clock down. I imagine there's a million other questions people have. I also know, because Brett said so at the beginning, we're the last thing between freedom, where freedom means Melbourne, which if you don't come from Melbourne may not be a promise. If you are from here, you are in 3 minutes' time allowed to almost be released. I want to thank this extraordinary panel and the real privilege, and to thank Simon for letting me come and attempt to wrangle you into coherence. I think if there were a summary of the pieces of this conversation, from where I sit at least, as we think about what the human face of warfare, military and conflict is, I think for me the important threads are one around the fact that those humans are never by themselves. They are in services, they are in relationships, they are part of histories as well as presents and futures, and that when we think about the human, we need to be thinking about them as also a connected thing, connected to a service, connected to the conflicts that service has had, connected to the vision that service has for itself, but also connected across services and connected, I think, in that way across time and history. And imagining the human there means that that human is always going to be, well, not singular and the same, but delightfully, wonderfully complicated. I think, the second piece for me of coming through this is, if we imagine and hold that that is true, then the work we need to do to scaffold those individuals and those relationships means paying attention both to how people come to us, how they stay with us and how they leave us, and also how we think about moments like this, but also all the moments that are required to ensure that we are holding ourselves to our best account, and that account is externalized, that it's scrutinized regularly, that it sees the power of daylight, so that it isn't ourselves telling ourselves we're doing a good job, but making sure that we have other people who hold us to account as well as holding ourselves to account. And that regardless of what technology is coming, the notion of needing capacity and capability and thinking about changes in speed, those are questions that I suspect have plagued and delighted military minds for millennia, you said, and I think that's probably right, and that what we have here is the opportunity to think about what the possibilities are, not the perils. And what I usually tell my students in moments like this, and shout out to Jacob Choi, who I know is somewhere in the room and was one of my students, I think as leaders we have twin obligations. An obligation to always be telling stories about the future, and a future that is more fair, just, equitable and sustainable than the present we find ourselves in, and that those stories should be hopeful, and that it is hard to remember to be hopeful in a time where cynicism, especially Australian cynicism, is something we're very good at. But the notion that we need to tell stories about a future that is better than the present in which we find ourselves, I think is the obligation of every leader. And then I think that's not enough. I think the second obligation is you have to find ways to actively disrupt the present to make those stories possible. That we shouldn't just be in the business of telling stories about the future, but actively working to bring it into existence. And I imagine for all of you, you have a role in doing that too. I want to thank you for taking the time today, and thank you for being active participants in building a different future than the present we find ourselves in. Thank you.
Thank you.